America, north of Mexico, in the 1600s remained largely unclaimed by Europeans. The first century of European exploration in the New World was chiefly precipitated by the empires of Spain and Portugal, whose northernmost borders stretched to present-day Texas. Other nations, most notably France and England, inspired by Spanish success, made feeble attempts to establish colonies before the turn of the century, but these efforts didn't last. The purposes of Chapter 2 are to explain how England became a colonial contender during its Renaissance, and why England's settlements first took hold along the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. It's to describe the settlement experience at Jamestown, to analyze the relationship English settlers had with the native people they engaged, and explain how Virginia colonies developed and influenced formations of other English colonies along the southeastern Atlantic seaboard. While discovery of the New World in the 16th century propelled Spanish empire's might past that of the Portuguese and into European superpower status, the Kingdom of England was hardly in a position to establish itself in the New World. How then did England become a colonial contender in the New World at the turn of the 17th century? It would be 110 years from the time John Cabot first sailed off the coast of Canada before a permanent colony in North America flew the English flag. During the first half of the 1500s, England was a devoted ally to Spain, so it took little interest in creating its own colonies. The alliance between England and its Catholic neighbors, including Spain, would end in the 1530s when King Henry VIII renounced England's fealty to the Pope and named himself head of the Church of England, beginning what is known as the English Protestant Reformation. While other reformers like Martin Luther were concerned with how the Catholic Church was corrupt, wasteful, and not carrying out the mission of Jesus Christ, Henry's deepest concern was divorcing his wife, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. Yes, that's right. This is the same king and queen that commissioned Columbus's trip to the New World. After naming himself the head of the English Catholic Church, Henry sent his wife out of the country and married a new lover. The life of Henry VIII is intriguing, so much so that Showtime dramatized it in a series called The Tudors. If you love violence as much as he loved his 6 wives, you can't go wrong. But the thing you need to know about Henry, as it pertains to American history, is that his exploits kept England fighting Catholic Spain and France instead of venturing across the Atlantic. In addition to naming himself the head of his country's faith, Henry VIII further inflamed tensions with his Catholic neighbors by conquering Ireland. When Henry died from an infection in his leg that he sustained while jousting, his children inherited a festering wound of civil war. While Henry's oldest daughter, Mary, would attempt to avenge her mother and restore Catholicism in England by burning Protestants at the stake, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary, she wouldn't last long. 5 years after taking the crown, she died of the flu and passed the crown on to her younger sister, Elizabeth. The daughter of Henry's second and beheaded wife, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth was a Protestant. In order to establish her authority and end religious division in her kingdom, Elizabeth I declared England a Protestant nation, officially replacing the Catholic Church with the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, and crushed the Irish Rebellion. English monarchs from this point forward would take lands from the Irish natives and give it over to landlords loyal to the crown, a practice that was continued in the New World by the English towards the Native Americans. British pirates were the first Englishmen to swarm to the New World in the 16th century. In addition to taking Irish lands, Elizabeth tacitly permitted profiteers and pirates to plunder Spanish treasure ships returning home from North and South America. Even though England and Spain were technically at peace, British nobles funded these pirates in return for a share of the booty. Most famous of these sea dogs was Sir Francis Drake, whose 3-year trip around the globe robbing Spanish netted investors, including Queen Elizabeth, profits of 4,600%. Though he didn't establish a colony on this trip, Drake made a stop near San Francisco Bay, claiming it for England. So appreciative of his success was the Queen that she knighted Drake aboard his ship, much to the chagrin of the nation of Spain. England's first attempt to permanently colonize North America came in 1853, but upon reaching Newfoundland, the crew found they did not have enough supplies to survive, so they claimed the land for England, turned around, and headed back home. The captain of the voyage, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, along with most of his men, perished in a series of shipwrecks on the way back to England. 2 years later, Gilbert's half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, was encouraged by the Queen to invest in a colony that could act as a staging point for conducting raids against the Spanish in the New World. Although he would never leave England to see his new colony, Raleigh planned for a more southerly location, which he dubbed Virginia, in honor of Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. On July 4th, the colonists walked ashore Roanoke Island, which is located off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Desperately depleted of supplies, most of the original colonists that survived the first year in the New World returned to England with Sir Francis Drake when he stopped at Roanoke after successfully raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. A second expedition settled in Roanoke in 1587, but when relief to the island arrived in 1590, the colony was found entirely abandoned. The only clue pointing to the disappearance of the colonists was a single word, Croatoan, carved in a tree. While future colonists widely accepted that the people of Roanoke were massacred by local Indian tribes, no bodies have ever been discovered by archaeologists that support this theory. The most widely accepted theory by historians today is that the colonists, fearing abandonment and facing starvation, left their village and integrated into the culture and communities of local tribes. American Horror Story Roanoke on FX is a great show, but this dramatization is for entertainment purposes only and is almost entirely devoid of historic fact, but it's still scary. These early efforts by England to colonize North America were put on hold for nearly 2 decades after the disappearance of Roanoke due to war and lack of willpower. Witnessing the defeat of Ireland and angered by the pillaging of his country's ships, Philip II of Spain used his nation's New World riches to amass what he called an invincible armada of ships for the invasion of England. This naval showdown came in 1588, when 130 Spanish ships lurched into the English Channel. But despite being outmanned, swifter, lighter British ships turned back this Spanish invasion and ushered in the English Renaissance. Defeating the Spanish superpower created a wave of nationalism in England that has been credited with sparking a cultural renaissance. The Crown invested heavily in art and literature. This was the age of Shakespeare. A national sense of pride and destiny also shaped England's foreign policy. The time felt right to make the world, including the New World, British. This table shows Elizabeth I and her ancestors through Henry VII and early attempts to colonize North America. This image is Elizabeth I in what has become known as the Armada portrait, created in 1588 by George Gower. You can see in the background images of the British fleet on the left and the Spanish Armada on the right. Elizabeth I is being proclaimed by the artist as Empress of the World. She had been accused of being vain, fickle, prejudiced, and miserly by her enemies. But Elizabeth proved to be an unusually successful ruler and is often credited with ushering in the Age of Renaissance. She never married, hence the nickname the Virgin Queen, although many romances were rumored and royal matches schemed. One of those rumored courtiers of Queen Elizabeth was Sir Walter Raleigh himself. Dashing and one of Elizabeth's favorites for his wit, good looks, and courtly manners, Raleigh launched important colonizing failures in the New World. For this portrait, Raleigh presented himself as the Queen's devoted servant, wearing her colors of black and white, and an emblem of a pearl in his left ear. After seducing and secretly marrying one of Queen Elizabeth's maids, he fell out of favor with her, but continued his colonial adventures in hopes of challenging Catholic Spain's dominance in the Americas. Some would call his actions piracy. Ultimately, he was accused of an attempt to try to depose King James I and beheaded for treason. The big takeaways from this unit, then, are that England was limited in its ability to colonize in the New World because of its relationship with Spain, the conflict that broke out between England and its neighbors when Henry VIII declared himself the head of the church and broke away from the Vatican, and the lack of willpower that existed after early attempts to colonize led to destruction. It would take an event that would make people desperate enough to want to go to this wilderness before England would have a foothold in North America.